Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is AJ van Bochoven. I'm Head of Strategic Innovation at Cambridge Consultants, and today, this afternoon, we're presenting about multi-modal R&D, and you'll hear more about it in a moment. I'm presenting together with my colleague, Matthew Little, who's a Senior Strategy Consultant. Don't say that when you've had 3 beers, not too easy to say. But what we're talking about here is multi-modal R&D. Basically, it's an approach where we utilize multiple sources of innovation, and we'll explain more about that in a moment. As we know, the pace of change has really increased. We've seen several people talk about that today already, from the video at the beginning of today, and obviously Carl, you referenced that as well. I think it's something that everybody recognizes. Sometimes it can even be quite exhausting for all of us, trying to keep up with whether it's technology or number of meetings or just generally the busyness of life. So it's relentless in terms of replacement of things, in terms of changing technology. It's also very fast, whether it is in our home life or whether it's in business, and it's everywhere. So companies need to adapt to this too, and need to work to become faster and be relevant and stay relevant in the changing world. If we stand still, as is obviously known by many companies that have fallen by the wayside, we are doomed to decline over time. So we need to continuously innovate, and we need to do so faster. And our premise is that to do so, internal R&D is no longer enough. This may sound a little bit harsh, and actually it's not meant in that way, because actually we are not saying that internal R&D is no longer relevant. It still has a key role to play in what we do, and I think probably all of you have internal R&D organizations. You were talking about it this morning with respect to the 140 people. Some of us have very large organizations, some of them have distributed organizations across the globe. But basically what we're saying is internal R&D is no longer enough, and multimodal R&D is required. Now, what we mean with that is the practice of utilizing different innovation mechanisms to supplement corporate R&D. With this increasing pace of change, doing everything internally is no longer enough. And actually, utilizing a wider variety of sources of innovation widens the landscape of innovation and gives you more opportunities. It broadens the stream of ideas and gives you more chance of actually being successful in the longer term. Now, nothing of this is new, you might argue, and I've seen several companies experiment with these different elements over the last 10 to 15 years. But it's definitely becoming more prevalent, and companies are starting to take it more seriously, rather than just as an experiment and invest a little bit to see what it will yield. They're seeing it as an essential part of the way they do business. Now, there's a range of traditional R&D models. You'll probably recognize most of those. In-house R&D I mentioned, joint ventures with different companies, mergers and acquisitions, and licensing we see as traditional mechanisms that have been around for many, many, many years. There are a range of newer models that have come to the fore, as I said, in the last 10 to 15 years, ranging from venture capital to open innovation and contract R&D. So what I'd like to do is to explain a little bit through some examples, because it's much easier to get your heads around these various different mechanisms. Some of them may be self-explanatory, others less so. So I'll pick on a few of these examples. For example, joint ventures and partnerships. Toyota and Uber signed a partnership to deal with the future of mobility. And actually, Toyota accessed Uber because they have a different business model for mobility, as you probably all know. But actually, Uber also needs Toyota because they're actually collaborating on autonomous vehicles. And there's a lot of technology, a lot of hardware that is required, where actually Uber probably doesn't have the same skill set. They're also very different businesses as well. One is very fast-paced, Californian-based, lots of money, lots of speed. Toyota is a traditional, one might argue, a conglomerate, a very big, successful organization in its current business. So how these two collaborate in a good way, that is critical to that multimodal R&D, as we'll find out later. Another really good example is Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods market. They bought that business a couple of years ago for nearly $14 billion. And it was actually to buy the market access and then to disrupt from within. So rather than entering as they have done many other markets, actually they've bought the business and now they're innovating from within and trying to disrupt that business. Because Amazon was not that knowledgeable about fresh food distribution, etc. So they acknowledged that they needed new skills, new expertise to access that. Now those are all some of the traditional examples. Let's look at some of the more modern or new examples. So Johnson & Johnson Innovation Center is a really great example of utilizing venture capital. They have a number of innovation centers across the globe where they collaborate at the moment with about 80 different startups that they have invested in. Now they are investing significant sums in these startup businesses, and they are kind of seeing it very much primarily as a financial return. So they are very ruthless, one might say, in terms of killing things and starting new things, giving people space, giving people assets and facilities like the labs that you can see behind you, for example, which many startup companies are struggling with. On the other hand, they're not just doing that to make money, but also to tie some of these things back into the main business. So what they quite cleverly do is they second people from the main Johnson & Johnson business into some of these startup businesses. And they do that for two reasons. One is to help the startup company to succeed, get a route to market, whether that's through Johnson & Johnson or elsewhere. But also those people that have been seconded learn from the startup companies and they go back into the main business. And the hope is that some of the magic from the startup company, some of the ways of working, rubs off to the main business effectively. Hitachi, we've got a few people from Hitachi in the audience, of course. They set up an incubator in Japan, and they are actually focusing it on very specific challenges that are social challenges to help improve the world, but also give a target to aim the innovation at. So it's not a random type thing that any innovation startup can come, but it's targeted and it's collaborative with Hitachi people. NASA uses open innovation platforms, and that's quite an interesting one as well. It's one that can be closer to the existing business, perhaps, where you pose a very specific, targeted challenge, a problem that is there to be solved. In NASA's example, they were posing a challenge to actually find a mathematical algorithm to predict what the medical kit on space stations should be like, to optimize it for the kind of medical emergencies that might be required. As you know, weight is critical on a space station. You'll probably know that from Iridium. So the less you can take with you, the better, but equally having an astronaut that suddenly needs to come back down because they're not well is not good either. So getting that balance right is important. Last but not least, we have Novartis and contract R&D partners. Novartis is one of our key customers, and our own business, we have seen a huge increase over the last 8 to 10 years of the number of projects, so that we now actually undertake more than 400 projects in any given year. So that's quite a significant number, and we see that growth year on year as well. Now, of course, none of these businesses just utilize this one model, and Matt will shortly talk a little bit about a specific example which uses all of the different modes, in fact. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits of multimodal R&D. Actually, it's primarily about connecting the internal and external innovation sources. Collaboration for success, absolutely critical, and actually widening the thought processes of the internal innovation by matching it with the external innovation sources is really critical there. Another benefit is innovation for diversification. So finding new opportunities, whether that is in startups or actually through academia, to diversify the routes of innovation and the type of options that you have is important too. Now, in the current climate, many companies are under quite a lot of financial pressure. So actually, multimodal R&D can help with that also, because as a result of the financial pressures they are under, but at the same time facing the pressure of staying relevant that I mentioned before, what companies are able to do with multimodal R&D is they're focusing their internal resource on the core business, on the value propositions that are fundamental to their business right now. And they're utilizing some of those external sources, those partnerships, to diversify and to effectively bet on certain opportunities that may or may not come. And internal resources sometimes difficult to let go, depending on the geography that you are in. So actually, the external sources are easier to switch on and off in that sense. From an external perspective, actually multimodal R&D can be an excellent way of finding new growth. A little bit like Johnson & Johnson, the startup has already found the growth opportunity, has already found the way in which to innovate and where it might be having traction. And what Johnson & Johnson is literally doing is they're stepping on the bandwagon of that particular startup. There's still risk, of course, and there's still a chance that things go wrong, but they are able to find and tap into a wider range of innovation and growth opportunities. Now, we talked quite a lot today about disruption. I think several people have mentioned that word, both in a good way and in a bad way. And often, of course, the people, I missed the last bit of your talk, so you may have talked about this too. So limiting disruption is kind of a survival mode, if you will. So if you are already a well-established business, and I think many of the people here today are in very established businesses, there is always the concern and the risk that this new startup or a completely different industry player from a different industry is suddenly appearing on your horizon with something that you had not seen coming. And multimodal R&D can help you limit that disruption by actually collaborating with them or buying them through investments like venture capital. Doing that can actually also mean that you can become the disruptor rather than the industry that becomes disrupted. So I think the disruption it's a good mechanism to manage that risk, basically. Last but not least, it's about speed and simplification. So I talked a little bit about startups already, but they tend to have a very flat hierarchy for obvious reasons. And they also tend to work very fast because they have to get something to market quickly, otherwise they're dead. There is no revenue, so therefore there's no business. Now that's very different from larger organizations that have an ongoing revenue stream and can do things in a different and more efficient, organized, scaled way. And so speed and simplification from those startups with a minimum viable product can really help to increase the speed of new innovations. So what I'd like to do next is briefly talk about strong innovators who actually consistently use multimodal R&D to source new projects and ideas for growth. So this was a survey that was done in 2016, and it asked participants to the survey what sources they were using for new projects and new ideas for growth. And we've just logged here the percentage of people who said often or very often to the various different sources. And the green bar are the strong innovators and the weak innovators are the gray bar. And you can see that the strong innovators, they still utilize internal R&D for the predominant source of their projects. So like I said earlier, internal R&D is not dead at all. It's actually critically important. But what interestingly most of the strong innovators are doing, 2/3 of them, are also utilizing a really wide range of other sources of innovation. And that's the key. Especially what they do is they look at, frequently utilize external third parties to come up with the new ideas, to come up with the new inspiration for projects. And this is partly because they come with a different mindset. It's partly because they look at things from a different perspective. They may be in a different industry, which means they link things together in a different way. And this can range from corporate strategic partnerships with other partners like Toyota and Uber, or academic partnerships, they have a role to play, as well as specifically hiring firms to generate ideas. So there's a whole range of different mechanisms there at play, and the key is to utilize the full spectrum of that and to know when to apply it. And Matt will talk briefly later about a framework that we've created to help companies to choose which mode is actually the best for different situations. What I do want to do first, though, is have a little bit of an interactive session. I said at the beginning that we were going to have this interactive, and I've been doing a lot of talking so far. So I hope you all have the app. Have you all got, most of you got the app? Yeah? So if you can open the app, first of all, and if you go to the schedule and click on the session that we're now in, A1, and if you then scroll down to just below our beautiful pictures, there is a live poll which is called what are the top 3 modes, innovation modes used by your organization? And if you click on that, you'll get a list that looks a little bit like this. And what I'd like you to do is to select the top 3 modes that your organization is using at the moment. Now, this is based on gut feel, obviously. So just the most effort, the most resource going into those different modes. So if you can just vote on those three things, that will be great. And then we'll take it from there. Excellent. So interestingly, we're still moving a bit. We're seeing that in-house R&D is working very well. That's great. A third of you see that as one of your top choices. Interestingly, venture capital is quite a low percentage, so that's still quite one of the newer ones. The other one that's interesting is all three of these actually are the newer models, so open innovation platforms, venture capital, those are all newer ones, and there's actually quite a small number of you who are dealing with that.
So what we'll be looking at now, having already discussed the definition of multi-modal R&D and received your inputs on what R&D models that your organization is using, is we'll be looking at a case study, an example, so to speak, of an organization that we believe is quite successful at employing multi-modal R&D. The case that we've picked out and the company is BASF. For those of you who don't know, it's the world's largest chemical organization. It has a footprint of over 11,000 R&D employees and spends over 2 billion per annum on R&D. Now, the chemicals industry itself may not have the most innovative perception, so you might consider this industry as old, traditional, heavy, slow, but actually BASF is renowned as one of the most innovative companies globally. And the BCG report that AJ shared earlier states them as one of the top 15 year on year as the most innovative companies worldwide. How do they do this? Well, they actually blend both sides of the model. So they take traditional and new modes and merge them together to great effect. And what we'll do now is I'll give you a couple of examples of how they're using the new modes to actually innovate going forward. They collaborate extensively. They have over 300 collaborations worldwide with universities, global centers of excellence, and companies. They have done this for years. It's part of their makeup, and in particular, a fantastic example is their collaboration with Adidas. They have over 20 years considered a strategic partner with Adidas. A recent output of that collaboration that's come out of great success is the Air Boost trainer. So some people in this room probably own a pair of Adidas Air Boost trainers, which retail at for about €75, euros. The sole...
It's about the same nowadays, isn't it?
Yeah, the sole itself, which makes the trainer innovative, is BASF materials. I don't think many people would know that actually BASF are behind that. Just one example. They've also ventured into open innovation platforms. They have used it to tackle some of their most difficult digital channels. They're a chemical company, they're not a digital company. They've opened up their doors to external startups to collaborate on these topics. Now, the funds that they offer, 50 to 100,000 euros, aren't massive. We know they're not going to change the world, but as you guys probably all know, that's a great seed fund to challenge and test early innovations. Their most recent endeavor in terms of multi-modal R&D is that they founded their first corporate incubator in 2018. Das Chemovator, as it's called, is set up as a separate legal entity. The rationale behind that is that it allows this particular company to overcome some of the complexities that are entrenched within BASF, the mothership, so to speak. The focus of this organization is to rapidly test non-core business opportunities and bring them to market as quick as possible. They do this in an agile, lean, cool work environment where people actually champion a fail-fast mentality. This is a far cry away from the traditional R&D approach within the mothership, so to speak. Lastly, their venture capital arm. It's been established since 2001. It has over 21 direct investments and is active in over 6 different funds. Again, much like the Chemovator, this is focused on non-core business. They look for growth opportunities that are adjacent to BASF's core business.
Am I right in saying that the incubators are from people from the inside going out and the venture capital the other way around?
The venture capital, for example, is everyone knows that BASF is involved heavily in agrochemicals. Some of the investments they're looking at are robotics, agri-tech robotics. So slightly adjacent, but linked to their core business as well. You can see there's a shift there. And also, we're talking about dispensing chemical products still. So it's still within their business scope. The venture capital is different from the incubator. The incubator is made up of what they call ventures. So they deliberately do not call them projects, they call them ventures, simply because projects have a finite time frame, ventures don't. They're made up of BASF employees that transfer into this separate legal entity and are there to basically rapidly incubate, rapidly test their ideas. And a lot of the ideas that are currently sitting within that incubator are slightly chemistry related. Most of them are digital business models. Again, BASF sells chemicals, it doesn't sell digital business models. So it's an interesting movement for BASF in that domain. But what these four areas do is that it paints an innovative picture of BASF that perhaps it wouldn't be perceived based on that industry. But the key point is that regardless of the industry, multimodal R&D has a valued place in our perspective. So now that we've covered an example, given a couple of key points of an organization like BASF, we're going to have a quick look at the framework that we've developed within Cambridge Consultants. As you probably can tell, it's a framework. In standard consulting practice, you have to show it in this manner. What it basically does is it takes the innovation drivers and plots them against the modes. It's a case of understanding what is driving an organization's innovation efforts, but more importantly, it's also understanding the idiosyncrasies of an organization. No two organizations are the same, and we're not saying that one size fits all. So it's a case of understanding your organization, understanding your innovation drivers, and trying to select the model that's best approach to your situation. To help us understand some of the drivers, we've clustered them. So, for example, certain modes might suit a focus on speed of delivery, or might suit a focus on external, so not your non-core business. Others might consider IP ownership and financial control as key drivers, and hence why they would be better suited to some models. Certain models will help a corporate perception, so based on where you're innovating in a global center of excellence, or actually they might help you instigate a change initiative. So it really depends on that kind of approach. There's no right answer. It solely depends on an organization's specifics, the industry it's in, but also its innovation horizons. So that also factors in as well. The framework itself helps organizations and our clients guide what type of mode they should be selecting, what type of mode they should be combining with traditional and new. And to that effect, it can really be based on an organization's drive to improve the speed of their innovations. It could be also focused on whether they want to invest in new markets, invest in new technologies. It could be an area where they're considering utilizing external subject matter experts. These modes may play well to some of the newer models that we've indicated. Additionally, so as with the Chemovator, if you wanted to create an agile, lean, cool, fast, fail-fast mentality work environment that caters to a new breed of employees, again, certain new models might be the best option. On the other hand, IP ownership, if you're also looking at retaining and growing your in-house R&D knowledge, this potentially may lead to the use of more traditional models. That's not to say there are pros and cons to each, it's just to understand that each has its benefits and cons. To reiterate the point, no one size fits all. And what's key, and I think AJ alluded to this early on, is finding the right balance between traditional models and new models. But where we believe is most important is understanding that regardless of the industry, multimodal R&D has a value and can drive innovation diversity. For ourselves, the framework is a fantastic guide that will help organizations find the sweet spot between traditional and new models. And with that, that's the end of the speech, so to speak. But what we have is another interactive session, so unfortunately you have to get your mobile phones out again.
Just a quick question.
Yep.
I'm curious to see IP ownership under contract R&D, because we find that we tend to push in-house R&D as a when we're worried about protection of intellectual property.
Yep.
Because you actually you lose an element of control
So-
with contract partners. That's quite a hard one to manage.
From my past experience, I completely agree. However, this model, you have to understand, framework is developed by Cambridge Consultants. One of our key drivers that we provide to our clients is that they own the IP.
Okay,
And
so in that model, it's...
Yeah, that doesn't apply necessarily for all contract R&D organizations. You're quite right.
No.
So, but the point being that you have these criteria, or drivers as we call them, and you can adapt this obviously to your own needs, and you will have your own experiences of the companies that you're working with, and then it depends on the situation. I think Molson Coors guy was talking about speed. If that's your prime driver, you will choose different mechanisms, and it will just help make that decision process.
Also, bearing in mind, we only have 10 on the slide here. That's simply because of space. This list is non-exhaustive and will change by
They are the
company.
most important ones there.
Critically, it's important an organization picks out the innovation drivers that are bespoke to them. So again, I hope everyone's got their mobile phones ready. And if you please go back to the app that we had on previously, if you click in live polls, there's a second question. What are your top 3 drivers for utilizing innovation modes? Fantastic. I am not surprised that speed to market it's been tracked back, but it is the top one. I was expecting that to be the major driver. What I would also have to say is you can quickly pick out accessing non-core technologies, so your non-core business as a key one as well. IP ownership and prospection, this is always never going to change. It's always what your gold nuggets really. Interestingly enough, and I didn't expect it as much, there's quite a broad spectrum still. So anything nearing 10% and above is indicating that drivers are bespoke to your organization. And I know we have a broad industry base here and organizations, so it really depends on your industry and specific organization in itself as well.
So the thing is, we've now looked at the different models. We've looked at criteria to select these different models. Now, how can we capture the value from that different innovation? Because ultimately, this is all fine and good. We can work with startups, we can invest in venture capital, but if it's not going to generate business result, it's a waste of time, effectively. What we've identified is that actually capturing the value from such multimodal R&D sources requires organizational flexibility. If you look at this graph, on the horizontal axis, you'll see different types of value capture. So you can capture value by growing your existing business, developing new products for the existing markets. You can grow adjacent business next to the existing business, or you can grow completely new business as well. And what we're saying is basically that the setting up of multimodal R&D without organizational flexibility will really limit the benefit that you get from it. So for example, if you utilize in-house R&D or licensing or contract R&D, actually the organization doesn't need to change. Your core current organization doesn't really need to change. The reason why contract R&D is in that bucket is because contract R&D companies usually adjust to your existing business where possible. Okay? They'll come up in another category as well, because they can be utilized as a mechanism to sort of break out of that too. On the other hand, external innovation sources often have very different cultures, organizations, processes, ways of working. So quite often you can have a real clash between, say, a startup business that wants to move fast and may run out of money in 6 months, and a big business that needs to take a year to assign new budgets for the next financial year. So what we're actually saying, for some of these modes, it's best to keep those at arm's length, to give them the space, to give them the opportunity to grow their own culture, their own ways of working, and to reap the results longer term once they've established themselves. There's another aspect to that, which is that big business makes judgments of investment based on big business. And actually, the decision making for small business is quite different, because initially the business may be so small that actually it doesn't warrant that investment, you might argue. But you can't see that long-term potential, you may miss the boat. So what we're suggesting is that actually for incubators, depending on how it's set up, venture capital and JVs and partnerships, they should be kept a little bit separate from the main business for that, precisely that reason, to keep their own culture, to keep their own way of working. Finally though, to really capture the value of most multimodal R&D, we do think that companies need to adjust their way of working. mainly because of that cultural aspect and the process aspect. And that's critical because actually often these sources are utilized to ultimately come up, as I said, with an adjacent business or a current business. That means it's utilizing some of the assets of your current business to be successful. So it can't be that you completely keep them separate, but at the same time you use them as an opportunity to change. And that leads to my last point, which is that actually it can go one step further. So what I've described here in terms of capturing value is just to capture the value from that innovation that that multimodal source has generated. But actually we can go one better than that, because we can utilize multimodal R&D also to actually exploit it as a change agent for transformation of your current business. To the beginning, when I said that change was relentless and our organizations need to continue to change, actually multimodal R&D and the different ways of working that that gives access to can rub off on the main organization and can instigate change, can instigate it to work faster in a different way and maybe generate some real change that helps you to succeed in the longer run. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.